listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I'm joined by a very special guest today. Audrey Renken has been on our sales team at True Native Media for nearly 3 years, and we wanted to bring her on the show today just to talk about kind of some ins and outs in the podcast ad space. She has been in the trenches. She has worked with agencies. She's worked direct with brands, and she knows a lot about podcast advertising. So we wanted to bring her on the show. Audrey, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I've been listening to it for years, and now I get to be a part of it.
Yay. Audrey, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background? What landed you in the podcast ad space?
Yeah. So, right out of college, I knew that I actually just whatever I was going to do, I wanted to be in sales. And so I think that the best way to put it is that I went from selling wine and spirits to selling television to selling digital to podcast and learning a little something along the way. But ultimately, I kind of knew, instead of direct to consumer products, I really wanted to work in an area that my creativity could kind of come to play. So I love building campaigns, and I'm also just an avid podcast listener. So yeah, asked you for a job.
So I would say out of all of the people on our team, I think you probably consume more podcast content than anybody. Would you say that's true?
I do. I feel like, my podcast consumption comes through Apple Podcasts, and I typically would listen to music on Spotify. And I think like a year and a half ago, I just completely ended my Spotify account just because I was not consuming music at all. I also work from home, so like commuting is just a little different. But whether it's like cooking, cleaning, just hanging out, I'm always listening to a podcast.
Yeah. So you're listening entirely on Apple?
Yes. Yeah. It's just been like my tried and true. If it's not broke, I don't want to fix it. I love to like just the interface and the simplicity of it, and just how that one app is like where my podcasts are.
Yeah, I agree. I used to split my listening up more amongst players, but I still really like Apple. And I think to your point, I feel like I'm there, like all of my subscriptions and all of my shows, and like trying to migrate to a different platform just feels harder. And to be honest, every time I use Spotify, I just don't like it. But I know lots and lots of people do, but it's just not my favorite.
I will say I have downloaded and utilized the Amazon app, I guess. And it's probably only, actually I know exactly why, but it's because one of the shows has kind of like a plus subscription service through them. So I bit the bullet and started to subscribe. So that is my one, I guess, alternative player, but it is like a one show thing.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you think advertisers are looking for in a podcast?
So like you had mentioned, I love the fact that I've kind of seen just this like direct conversation with brands and as well as agencies when it comes to podcast advertising campaigns. And I feel like when I think about like what makes a podcast attractive to a buyer or a CMO or, anyone looking to advertise, I feel like there's always 3 parameters that I think of. So there's a partnership parameter kind of subset, and then there are like performance parameters, and then of course purchasability. So for the partnership, of course, it's like authenticity. Is the host, really into the product? I feel like having an engaged audience. Are there positive reviews? I think too, like just anything that I guess maybe the host has mentioned in the past that they could natively bring in. All of those things like really make a fun partnership, right? That is organic and native. And then I guess on the performance side of things, I feel like trackability is one thing for sure. Any historical success. So renewals, right? Like if you have a success story about a podcast that you can share with the advertiser that is similar, I feel like that's a good one. And then I would say ad read examples too. Those are big ones. Mm-hmm. And then I guess in terms of like the overarching thing, it's always going to be a purchase parameter, right? So is the audience the right size? Are, the CPMs approachable? Are they interested in, integrating more things? Those are just kind of like, I guess the things that I I take into consideration.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like all of those are so important and really powerful. One of the things I feel like we talk about so often is the price point. And while price is important because we do have so many direct response advertisers in this space, looking at a show and saying, hey, this is a show that does convert well, this is a show that other advertisers have had success on, really tells an important story. And I'm curious what your thoughts are because I know we have experienced where we'll have a show that can perform really well for one advertiser and maybe not as well for another advertiser. So when you think about performance, are you looking at it on a like a category basis? Like, oh, this show really responds well for maybe clothing or maybe supplements, or like how do you look at performance because of that difference?
Yeah. So just like in any podcasting question, it's all relative, right? There are so many different factors that kind of play into performance. But when I guess I am explaining, let's say to a buyer, why I think that they would be a good fit because of historical performance or, a success story in the past, it kind of falls into either, like you were saying, kind of that industry or that product kind of category. Are they similar? Are price points similar, right? One show could be really, really great at selling clothing at X price point, but an advertiser comes in with 3 times the cost of the previous one and it's not going to work, right? And then I also feel like if you look at online services, similar to everything, they're fairly turnkey, whereas consumer products or direct to consumer products, it just gets a little trickier to kind of navigate. But I would always go back to one, that category similarity, and then two, that price point.
Yeah. I know we were talking with one of our hosts the other day, and she mentioned that she's, really reaching that kind of 20 to 30-year-old. And I know she mentioned directly that, of course, her audience is looking for high quality, but really what they're looking for is that kind of affordability and, making sure the value is really there. And I thought that was a really an astute observation on her part, that she knew, hey, if we're going to bring in this really high dollar amount advertiser, it's not going to convert well. And one of the things I always think is important for us to look at too is that conversion cycle, right? So it's like, okay, depending on the audience you're reaching and that tick you're reaching, and okay, this audience is good for that price point, but also we can see quick conversions with this because it's a low dollar amount subscription program. That's going to be very different than, hey, you should buy this, 1,000+ item. Maybe it's a new mattress, or maybe it's a car, or it could be anything, right? That consideration length is going to be longer. So, making sure you have the right audience, making sure that I guess your KPIs are set appropriately for the type of product is really important. Is that kind of what you've seen?
Yeah. And I feel like too, the beauty of podcast advertising is that these hosts aren't just telling you about a product. They're typically integrating their lives, their own personal experience. They're telling a story. And so, especially when it comes to those kind of higher dollar items, I think that it's invaluable, right? That you are having basically a conversation is being had in front of your, consumer or your ideal customer's ears. And I feel like based on the price of the product or services that they're talking about, of course, anything, easy or anything lower, I guess that price point is always going to be an easier, in my mind, faster conversion. The beauty of podcasting is that you can kind of help people get to that conversion a little bit faster through ad reads. So
right, through that quality ad read. Well, so to kind of piggyback on what you were just saying, the reality is that we have these hosts, they are trying these products. They are, obviously communicating the ad read to their audience. And I am always shocked. I've said it on the show before. I'll say it again. I am shocked at the number of podcasters who turn down advertisers. When I started in this space, like, wait, what? Like, they want to give you money. Did you realize that? And so many hosts do not just go for any advertiser. And so I'm curious, what do you think makes a podcaster either approve an advertiser or decline an advertiser? What does that look like?
So from a seller's standpoint, right, I want everyone to say yes on all sides. However, I think just through experience in selling podcast advertising, I've actually kind of come to enjoy the pickier host, right? So if a host is kind of giving us feedback when we're vetting them for a potential partnership, a lot of times we'll kind of ask, hey, we see that you said no to this product. We would love to kind of understand why. That one helps us kind of understand the host a little bit better. But two, I think that it allows me as a seller, right, to tell the buyers, hey, they said yes, they're very picky, which basically means, right, they are extremely interested. This is a very authentic interest and could be a really great partnership. It's going to come from a really authentic place. But I think in terms of like what I would say hosts kind of gear towards is any partnership or potential partnership that requires a personal endorsement needs to have, of course, that personal alignment. That aside, hosts really do tap into, okay, is this going to allow for a lot of audience alignment? So as I like to think, I know their audience from numerical and data standpoints, they really do have the best grasp on their audience. And so again, we go to that price point. Is this too high of a price point for my audience to even, afford? Or is this feeling a little corporate and I don't really want to make it seem like I'm pushing X, Y, and Z down my listeners' throats? I feel like those two things, right? So personal endorsement has to equal personal alignment. And then hosts will always, tap into their audience. I will say the one, I think, frustrating part of kind of allowing the podcast hosts to understand is that product alignment and content alignment are completely different, right, than audience alignment. And so, while it might be this online service for X, Y, or Z, and your podcast is a true crime podcast, it makes sense to the buyer's mind, to the seller's mind, and for the audience. So.
Right. Yeah, I feel like it's so interesting because we will often say things like, why don't advertisers choose true crime shows more often? Or why don't advertisers choose this genre or that genre? But it's the same way with the podcast, right? The podcast so often will turn down someone because they'll say, oh, well, my show doesn't talk about that kind of stuff. And I'm like, it doesn't matter that your show isn't a health show. Everyone needs supplements. Like everyone could take this and benefit from it, right? But the host can get really myopic sometimes. And I do feel like for us, our job is to try and expand that. But to your point, we also really do want to try, because when we're talking about this endorsement piece, we want to try to make that fit as strong as possible, because we know that when the host is really excited about the product, most often it's going to perform better at the end of the day because the host is genuinely interested in it. And it's not like, oh, just pay me this and I'll read this thing, right? There is that personal connection. So I feel like that's really an important piece.
Yeah, I was going to say too, I feel one of the things that we do at TrueNative, or, our sales team does, is really kind of get that feedback from the host initially prior to even really presenting a lot of options sometimes. And so I think that is a really great opportunity to, again, get to know the host, let the brand kind of see who the host is. And then, on the flip side, I've actually seen a lot of buyers recently that will, ask us to vet the host. Okay, they've said yes, and they've said nice things about it, right? But no, we want to send them product first and then get their real take. And I think that that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting how some companies are like all in on let's get the product out there ASAP, and then others aren't so much. But it also depends on the product and the service. But it is nice when you can, like, the host has the product and they can say yay or nay, for sure.
Definitely.
So in terms of the campaigns you've worked on, I'm trying to think, I wish I had a number, but I mean, you've worked on hundreds of campaigns since you've been at TrueNative. Is there one that stands out to you as like maybe being a favorite campaign, or one that was really interesting?
Yeah. So one of my kind of like favorite, if you will, campaigns was a CBD company, Tanasi, who you actually had someone from their team on the podcast. But Tanasi came to us, and having, never advertised really on podcasts before, very, very green in the space, and kind of trusted us to facilitate and curate this, list of shows that was super diverse. We didn't really, while they, yes, have an understanding of kind of who their ideal target customer would be in terms of podcast demos, it was a little hard for them to kind of grasp. And so we really wanted to allow a lot of room for a test. I think we were on like 13 or 14 shows for the first round, all trackable through Pixel, or I guess Pixel attribution. And I think my favorite part, or the reason that I really like it, is because the campaign itself performed great, but we realized this one kind of subgenre, which ended up being sobriety or sober curious podcasts, just blew everything out of the water. And had we not kind of tested one or two of the shows in, that space, obviously they would have never known. They are now an annual advertiser with us, and it's a really exciting kind of opportunity to keep presenting them with options and keep testing. I feel like they were really open-minded about kind of being on true crime, which a lot of maybe, buyers aren't, or just kind of out of the box opportunities. I think that really allowed us to get a bigger picture on where they could see success. And now they're, in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break down their campaign, because one of the things that I feel like we talk about on the program so often, and we certainly talk about internally at True Native a lot, is the very first time you run podcast advertising, you really are running it as a test, right? And there are certain factors that go into running that test to make it either a success or not a success. So as you're thinking about putting together a test campaign for a brand new advertiser, I think especially somebody who's never been in the podcast ad space before, what are some components that go into creating a really successful test?
Yeah, so kind of full circle moment. It goes back to those like 3 P's, those parameters, right? Like, is the host excited? We want the host to be just as excited, if not more, to partner with this brand than the brand is. And seeing that right off the bat through gathering that feedback is always going to be, super important. And then I think being able to identify, right, maybe they have an idea of who their listener is, or their, I guess, ideal customer is. We, of course, will add shows and include shows that kind of fit those demos, while also maybe exploring a little bit outside of that one way or the other. So, hey, we're like 35 plus, we're not really sure, but we can stick around the 35, 45 range, right? Maybe let's go a little higher, maybe let's go a little lower in terms of age or primary age ranges, similar to, I think, male to female, when brands are fairly universal. And going back to like old sales days, the most desirable shelf in the grocery store, right, is always going to be that like third from the top, because your ideal, I don't know, back in the day, like person shopping would be at eye level, right, with those products. Similar to, I think, podcasts, we really want to like line up everything that they believe to be true or think is true, as well as allow them to kind of explore the other places, like the end caps at the grocery store. So I feel like just in terms of putting together a successful campaign, you've got to diversify your audience, right? Somewhat. You also want to maybe test on smaller to mid-sized shows that allows, again, to test on multiple shows. And then also just really making sure that, that partnership is an exciting and authentic one.
What about tracking results? How does that kind of play into that initial test?
Yeah, I feel like, honestly, in terms of direct advertisers I've worked with that were brand new to podcast advertising, or even just fairly new, I have always kind of explained, like, I will be doing you a disservice if we do not include attribution tracking to this campaign. I think that, a lot of times people can get really hung up on the old school influencer days where it was like just a promo code. It's an easy to track solution, right? Or a vanity URL. I've always kind of told buyers that I look at tracking podcast campaigns as kind of like a 3-tier cake, right? So you've got that promo code. It's always there. It's tried and true, but there are a lot of sites and browser extensions that can pick those up very easily and then really kind of ruin that data for you. The second would be that vanity URL. As a millennial and avid podcast listener, I don't remember the last time I typed in a full URL, or I think, adding it to the show notes is totally a great thing to have, but typically, right, you're not going to take that action right away. And so again, that would kind of hurt your results in terms of tracking. But at the top of that tier is always going to be attribution. And it really kind of catches 2 of the 3, if you will, but it'll always kind of catch those missed data points that advertisers otherwise wouldn't know. I would say the other thing too is I've been working through campaigns with someone who maybe didn't notify their tech team that they were running this promo, and the tech team was automatically applying like much higher discount when people were purchasing items or checking out. And what actually saved us was an exit survey that said, how did you hear about us? And they were only running podcast ads with us. So we were kind of able to catch some things there. But again, it just was another lesson in that attribution is always going to be important. And we wanted to make sure that we can kind of show which shows are performing and also which ones or which verticals you want to retest in.
Right, for sure. So I think some of the things that you said that are really important are that kind of widening your reach in terms of genre. So, like you had mentioned, so often advertisers come in and they feel really clear that they only want to advertise in this genre. And so expanding that and looking at their target demo. So maybe if their target demo is outside of the original genre they were thinking of, testing a little bit wide is really helpful, and testing a big enough quantity of shows so that you can see the results. And then that's really kind of piggybacked with the attribution tracking. And one of the greatest things, in my opinion, with attribution tracking, and it's so fascinating to me when you open up, a dashboard and you're like, man, this show killed it. This one, not so much, right? It's like you can see the stark differences, and then that allows you to go ahead and take that information and iterate and iterate. And that's the most important piece, right, of the test, is that it's, yes, of course, we all want to see success. And, if you and I could sit here right now and say, hey, every advertiser, come on board. We are, sure that we're going to give you a 200%, return on ad spend. Like, yeah, everyone would be lining up to buy ads from us. But the reality is that first campaign in particular will often not be a total slam dunk, because you're learning the medium, you're learning the genres that work, you're learning the talking points that work, that call to action that works. So there's so many different elements that really have to be broken down to see success. And in that first trial campaign, you really want to create that foundation of learning so you can build on that. One thing we didn't talk about is, I feel like there's a lot of conversation around I guess the length that a campaign should be. And there are some very seasoned buyers in this space that will buy an ad or like a week of impressions. And in my humble opinion, I just don't think that is enough of a trial period to really see results. And I always just think about it from myself as a consumer, right? It's like, if I see a product one time, or if I hear about a product one time, I'm not likely to just run out and buy it that first time. I think especially if it tends to be a more complex product, right? It's like, if I'm buying clothes for like a winter getaway and I hear an ad for this like really great, affordable, sustainably sourced cashmere, I might be more open to it, because I'm not having to like wonder, what is cashmere? Like, am I sure that I want that? Right? It's like, I already know the product, but if you put something in front of me that's I've never heard of, that maybe is a more obscure supplement, or even CBD, right? Like, maybe I've never tried CBD before, or maybe it's a software product that isn't something that I've really been needing. Maybe that ad is helping create a want in me, but I'm not necessarily going to take action on that first, exposure to the product. So what are your thoughts about kind of the length that a campaign should be?
So again, a lot of different facets around everything, but I think if we're talking host-read DAI flights, right? It's an impression-based buy. Typically, what I will always recommend is minimum, I would say 6 weeks. Now, I've seen a lot of buyers test out for a month at a time, and they've seen success there. But really, I think the beauty of a host-read ad, right, and working with the host in this partnership, is that they can switch these ads up. And the beauty of DAI is keeping that stuff fresh. And I think allowing kind of the listeners or the audience to learn and meet the brand when the podcast host begins speaking about it, and then really kind of learning throughout, right, as that frequency gets up. Unlike traditional display or swipe up ads, podcast advertising, as we know, typically does take a little higher of a frequency to start seeing those conversions. And so when a brand is interested in one show for 1 month, it's a really hard kind of conversation to have, right? Because you want to allow enough time to start to see those conversions. And that's when we see them starting to ramp up. And if you cut the hose off right there, you really have no idea how successful the entire campaign could have been.
Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah. And, I recently had one of my guests on the show comment about how other forms of advertising have such a short kind of turnaround time where, like, we can instantly see that there has been success or maybe there hasn't been success. I still, though, go back to this idea that there is exposure to product and there's a brand for every company, right? And either people are familiar with your brand or they're not familiar with your brand. Either they're familiar with the product type that you're selling or they're not. And your brand awareness within your target demo makes a huge difference on how quickly people are going to convert or not. And if you're a brand new startup company, or if you're a direct to consumer brand that no one's ever heard of before, you can't necessarily expect, I personally think, in any form of advertising to come in and see immediate conversions. It's just going to take time.
Yeah. And I think the beauty of a host read ad, right, is like your best friend telling you about this brand new product or, company that they discovered from their older sister or whoever, right? And when you're hearing that, like, almost kind of recommendation, that is when, again, those companies that don't have that much exposure or that much recognition can really benefit. It just is going to take a little while.
Right, right. So you mentioned that you listen to a ton of podcasts, and I know you do because we talk about it, but do you have like an all-time favorite podcast?
So I will say that my gateway was Crime Junkie. Like, I mean, 100%. I think I listened to probably 200 episodes in like a 3-month period. It was insane. So I'm a true crime fan, but I would say kind of like as I ventured out, I've really started to enjoy those kind of storytelling podcasts. The Opportunist is one that I've just been like binge listening to for quite a while now. Can't get enough of that. But yeah, I mean, I would say just really anything in the true crime, not as so much on the gory side, but just more so on the storytelling side and just personalities and yeah, just really interesting kind of stories is my jam.
So I feel like sometimes we should just create you as the poster child of true crime because so many advertisers are looking to reach someone in your demographic, and yet they shy away from true crime so much. And all I want to do is just shout from the rooftops, like, true crime is a really good place to reach women who buy a lot of products. And I guess I'm curious because I think one of the statements that I hear often is, yeah, but won't it be weird? Like, we're going to hear, oh, this person got their foot chopped off, and then it's going to go right to an ad read, and that'll feel weird, and our product will be associated with it. So, as someone who has consumed a lot of true crime, and I'm sure heard a ton of ads in true crime podcasts, what has your experience been like?
Yeah, so kind of going back to like Crime Junkie, I think Audio Check in general does a really great job of, honoring the stories that they're telling, right? And it is by no means an opportunity for a clickbait kind of conversation to be had. I have obviously also heard the complete opposite, where people really are honing in on that. And to some people, maybe that's the kind of content that they want to consume. But I would say it's a common misconception that all true crime is just that massively disruption vibe, if you will. I think that the really great thing about true crime that I don't think a lot of people realize is that it is a non-saturated genre right now. And so,
Right.
all of these supplement companies, which I love, by the way, but they're fighting tooth and nail to get into these health and wellness shows. And they're just one of a million brands, right, trying to get these people's attention, or listeners' attention, whereas you've got like a primed and prepped and ready audience that has not heard of all 50 other supplements that are currently running, right, in the health and wellness space. Again, while yes, it absolutely aligns with that health and wellness content piece, like you said, everyone needs supplements, not just people that listen to health and wellness podcasts.
Right, right, right. Yeah. So fascinating. Well, I know we need to start wrapping it up, Audrey. So I am curious now that you're in the podcast ad space for a while, and oh my gosh, I feel like things change so rapidly here all the time. What do you see the future of podcast advertising being? What are your predictions?
It's a good question. So I think that there already is, but there's just going to be a much larger shift to those really integrated, right? 360 campaigns. It's not just the audio ads anymore. It's the social, it's the newsletter, it's everything. That would definitely, I think, be more of an immediate future. But I had an idea the other day, and I'm sure someone's probably already thought of it, but someone was kind of giving a conversation about the frustration that some brands, especially brands that you can purchase in store, have when it comes to tracking results through podcast ads. And what I thought was an interesting take was, if I'm listening to a podcast that I love on my whatever player of choice, Apple, I think it would be really great if Apple allowed for QR codes to be put in show notes or on a podcast. And if you were to maybe go purchase something in store, being able to scan that as a discount code, if you will, and really, again, allowing that attribution to be taken back to the podcast, I think that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I love
a lot of tech.
that idea.
I just see a lot of tech in the future of podcasting and it ever evolving. So
yeah, no, for sure. Well, Audrey, thank you so much for being on the program. If someone is interested in talking to you about podcast advertising, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Audrey Renken, or feel free to email me through our True Native Media website. Always open to have conversations and talk about podcast advertising. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the program. I hope that you have enjoyed this interview as much as I have. Of course, I might be a little biased, but it's always fun to talk about podcast advertising and how we do it here at True Native Media. If you haven't had a chance to check out my YouTube channel, please go on over and subscribe and watch there. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.